My name is Andrew Morris, and this is my demo of my JavaScript tutorial. Let's see. In my tutorial, I learned how to use variables, expressions, conditions, loops, functions, and classes. They started me out. I ended up using W3 Schools for the tutorials, as you can see here. They had me start by setting up Java and downloading it to my computer. Then they showed me different data types. Then type it casting, operations, and commenting on things as well. Then they had me do string, math, and booleans, which are true or false statements. After a while, we managed to get to the some if-else statements, which allowed me to learn different types of ways to use the code. I went into the actual files for the tutorials and brought them over to my computer to test many of them out. It's a bit different though than Python was when I first started using it though. I noticed at first that it actually started with a class, which in this case for the if-else statement is public class if-else. I've also found that if this section where this if-else wording here is different from the actual file, it will not be able to run. After that, when I was learning, and then the other thing I noticed, this is actually a difference I noticed with the if-else statements, that that's different from Python is the fact that they use brackets in theirs, and also that they have to actually have the else statement behind the if they are continuing with an else statement. Whereas we have, they also had an elif statement, but rather than using the word elif like we do in Python, they actually have an else if statement, which does the exact functions the same way as an elif. After they taught me if-else statements, they eventually taught me different types of loops and switches. A switch, which is something I have not exactly seen in Python as much, allows it so that way it basically allows them to put in input and then have different variables happen, much like a bunch of if-else statements, but simplified. They have some while loops, which basically are a thing that says continue doing this until this happens. For loops, which can be used with lists. And then they taught me arrays. Both regular arrays that only have one set of variables, like here, different types of variables right here, like Volvo, BMW, Ford, and Mazda, or multi-dimensional arrays, which have lists within inside lists. After that, they taught me how to use methods. The one I found most useful was actually recursion, which would allow me to call upon a static in this case, which is what they call them, whereas we would call them in Python a def, usually. In this case, this one would call upon itself to cycle through the thing again over and over again. To see what happened if you had 10, in this case, this code here has has k10, which then would say if k is lower than 0, it would return k plus k minus 1 until eventually, and then it would call upon itself to recycle through here again until eventually k was equal to 0, in which case it would return 0. Adding them together, you would get 55 as an end result. I'm not going to run it here because it takes a while to run. They eventually taught me classes as well. There were different kinds of classes, including inheritance, which I found very useful in some cases. Like for instance, saying that the class car is an extension of vehicles. In this case, vehicles is here. So we'll call the vehicle, so the class car will run, have a model name, and then it will call upon car to make a new object. And then it'll use car, my car, honk, and it will see if it's a car, which is also part of a vehicle, it will then run this. If say, for instance, you had a class that was say cow extended to animal, that means it would not be able to run class vehicles. They put me through different classes, and I all found them very useful. It wasn't until I got to user input that I found most useful, which allowed me to input something into JavaScript or into Java, which is something that we actually do quite frequently in Python. I don't know how that happened. Which is something we use quite frequently in Python, where we have an input variable. But for Java, it's a much more complicated process, I found, that takes something called a scanner object, which is basically something that allows you to basically scan to see what your input is. Then it makes a variable which uses the new object and says, in the next line, I want you to type something in and then put it in, then make that string username equal to that, which then it will then use to print out. As you can see here, I did that previously. Using these tutorials, I actually realized that I actually quite enjoy this and thought that I should eventually start creating a text game, which is something that I eventually ended up doing. You can see that later though in my next video. Anyway, have a good day, and I hope that you have a wonderful day.